governing body. There's Steve. Hi, Steve. Good to see you again. So a quorum of the governing body can conduct the business. So when 5 or more of you are together, that's interpreted by Open Meetings Act to say the body exists at that point in time. So you have to be really, really careful about that, but it's not just physical existence. So on this bullet point, where I say it applies to all meetings with a quorum of members, that can exist in many ways. It can exist in this room with 5 of you sitting in these chairs. It can exist through email. It can exist through text. It can exist through a conference call, through a Zoom meeting, all of the above. That can be a quorum when you're conducting the business, talking about the business of the city. Now, that's where everyone gets the most heartache, right? Well, this is a close-knit community. We see each other in the grocery store. We're going to be hanging out at the Chamber of Commerce meeting 2 weeks from now, right? What risks do we have out there? Well, the risks are that if people want to play gotcha, they're going to try and play gotcha. And I'll give you some examples of reports to the Attorney General's office. We had, during COVID, a streamed meeting with a school board, and they took a break 2 hours into a meeting. They took a 15-minute break. That was fine. Camera was focused on the center of the dais there. 5 members got together and just talked about their day in the center of the dais. Someone complained to the AG's office saying a quorum was sitting there talking about the business of the city. No one could hear what they were talking about, but they made the complaint that 5 of them were gathered together. They had to have been talking about the business of the entity. I'm complaining to the AG's office, and several $1,000s later of answering all of those things, the AG's office found it wasn't a problem, but they cautioned against those types of gatherings, right? So when I'm talking to school boards, the biggest example, and we'll find a similar example, but biggest example is a basketball game, the high school basketball game on a Friday night. Members just happened to, a quorum of members just happened to see each other, and they go over to the corner and they're chatting about their day or their kids or their cousins or their parents. And again, someone sends in a complaint and says, a quorum, we're sitting there at the high school game and they planned out the next 10 years of business for the governmental entity. So be aware of that. I want also to focus on the emails, texts, and phones, especially the emails though, where we see our biggest violations and the biggest problems with the Attorney General's office is the email. And now with everyone using more text, it's texts. So, and by the way, they've got a document trail. So when the AG's office asks, well, we got a complaint that there was an email, 5 members were emailing each other saying, here's how we're going to vote next Wednesday on agenda item 5, right? There's a document trail. And you go, doesn't look good. They were talking about the business of this. When I communicate with governing bodies, now, by the way, that applies to the membership. 5 of you just using, I'm not saying any of these happened here, by the way. These are just examples big and broad throughout the state. 5 of you cannot communicate with each other, but I can communicate with 5 of you. A member of the public can communicate with 5 of you. Your city manager, your city attorney can communicate with the entirety of you, much less a quorum, but you cannot communicate with each other after that. So when I send an email to a governing body, to a city council, and I send it to the whole membership, here's my legal analysis, this is my opinion, et cetera, et cetera. On top, it says confidential attorney communication. Do not reply all or forward, so that you don't risk that communication back. It's okay for me to communicate to you. You can't communicate amongst yourselves. I'm not a board member. I'm not a governing body member. So where folks trip up is the rolling quorum. We've also heard of vote counting, right? Oh, I counted my votes. I've got a majority. Let's go. Be very cautious about that, because if let's say I'm a governing body member and I go to the first one, how are you voting on this? Second one, how are you voting on that? Believe it or not, that's all okay under the Open Meetings Act. Third one, that's okay, because it's only 4 of us total. I go to that 5th one, then there's a problem. There also becomes a problem if I go to the first one and the first one goes to 3 more, right? It's the total count of the folks that were involved when there's a quorum. So be wary of that. That's where people are looking for our governing bodies to trip up. And that's a problem. I'll get into consequences later. But rolling quorum, I spend a lot of time on, because that's where the AG loves to sting people, is on rolling quorums. And it happens. And I've had governing body members playing gotcha with each other. Someone sends a communication to a quorum. Emails get forwarded pretty easily to the press, to the AG's office. So we just be cautious, and we be aware of that. Next slide. Any questions on rolling quorum? Okay. Again, that one can be pretty controversial. So if you're conducting business and you have a quorum, you need to meet in an open session. That's the basics of the first slide. Well, there are exceptions to that. And that is that the Open Meetings Act recognizes executive sessions that says you can go into a closed meeting for certain reasons. Bless you. And there are about 9 or 10 reasons. I only highlight the ones that tend to apply to municipalities. Limited personnel matters of any individual public employee. So if we're dealing with confidential employee information, right, we don't want to air that in an open session, right? We don't want to violate any privacy rights in an open session, going over evaluations, or maybe an employee got into a tough position. Maybe there's something that happened that has criminal consequences. We don't know. There are several circumstances when you go into executive session to talk about individual employees. For our governing bodies, most often it's their executive officer, right? Or it's a city manager, it's a superintendent, city administrator, chief administrator, all of those. But anytime there's personnel issues, you have the ability to discuss that in private, to preserve the privacy rights of the person. So you can go in on limited personnel matters. If you're doing collective bargaining with unions in your city, then you can go in and discuss those status of those negotiations in executive session. Reviewing competitive sealed proposals under the procurement code when they're over 2,500, you get to discuss those proposals in executive session. Now, the caveat, the big holdup on all of this is you get to discuss it. You don't get to decide it. You still have to come out into open session and decide it. Attorney-client privilege discussions of pending or threatened litigation. The lawyer has to be involved. Either their advice through a memo or the lawyer's presence. It allows you to have those attorney-client discussions. And the discussion of acquisition or disposal of real property or water rights. I love that example the most because it is a good protection. Can you imagine if you had to have all the discussions about buying property in public? You'd have to vote and say, well, we approve buying that piece of property for 200,000, but see if you can get it for 150,000. Good luck, right? They're going to know you've got 200. That's going to be your sales price, right? So these types of things where you're negotiating, that tends to be the theme on some of them, or confidential personnel information, you get to go into executive session. However, People get stung on executive session, governing bodies get stung on executive sessions all the time because they will put placeholders on their agenda. Every agenda, they'll list all the exceptions. And if in the moment, they figure, oh, let's go talk about personnel, let's go into executive session. 2 rules of thumb, only 2, not 3, 2 rules of thumb. And that is, number 1, that you gotta know what you're going into executive session about at the time that you're posting the agenda. So it can't be just something that comes up willy-nilly. You've got to know when you post the agenda. Now, how do you prove that? You've got to be reasonably specific in your description of the executive session item. And so when you're talking about real property, it's going to be executive session for the discussion of the acquisition of lot 5 in subdivision X, right? You've got to disclose what property you're talking about, but you don't have to say to figure out if we're going to pay 2,000 or 200,000 or 150. The public just needs to know we're going in to talk about acquiring that property or selling a property. We're going to sell the old fire station, right? Well, public should know that you're considering selling the old fire station. Where else am I going with that? The reasonable specificity and attorney-client privilege discussions regarding pending litigation. Because I've had governmental entities stung by not doing a sufficient description, I just list the lawsuit. Smith versus City of Portales, State Court number CV 2023-001. You get more specific. It's already a public record. We don't need to hide it. Just list it. And we do that. And that passes Attorney General scrutiny for reasonable specificity. The most difficult part is always the limited personnel matters, right? And the AG has investigated and questioned people, questioned governing bodies over use of that. It's this weird and difficult balance between the privacy rights of the individual and the confidence to the community that you're talking about an identifiable person. Where I've had governing bodies stung was, here's an example. Budget was short and there needed to be RIFs. And the governing body said, oh, that involves personnel. Let's go into executive session to see whether or not we're going to have RIFs this year and where we're going to have them. And the AG's office, reductions in force, right? We're letting folks go, budget's short. And the AG's office said, no, time out. That's a public discussion. The public should know whether or not you have sufficient budget for enough employees, what departments might be affected. Now, when you get maybe to an individual employee or a couple of identifiable employees, that may be a little bit different to help get you into executive session. But the discussion about whether or not we need to lay people off is a public discussion. That make sense? Makes sense so far? Good. I appreciate it. I've got everyone's attention. That's great. Let's make sure before I move on from this that I've hit all my points. Publicly noticed, specific. You cite the specific statutory provision by mentioning limited personnel matters, and you use a reasonable specificity. I've got best practices later, which is again the no placeholders, the blank exceptions. Personnel matters on every single agenda. The entities get stung for that. Okay, next slide. Thank you. All right, so what are some other basics? This one hopefully will help staff understand why everyone's so rigid about the agenda. It must be published 72 hours in advance of the meeting. And if it is 71 hours and 59 minutes, guess what? The meeting's delayed. The meeting's delayed. So when you've got folks, administrators saying, you got to get this in by Wednesday because we're publishing on Friday. Oh, I need a little more time, or I'm not ready. I've got these other things. It's because everything's on a deadline. And if you miss that deadline, it wreaks havoc. And then again, back to whether the community feels like they trust the governing body, right? Oh, I'm sorry, we had to cancel because our agenda didn't go out on time. That has a bad ripple effect. Once that agenda is published, nothing can be added. And by the way, on the 72 hours in advance, this is subtle, so make sure everyone gets it. The publishing happens in several manners. Most importantly is on the website. Because the statute says if you have a website, which you do, it's got to be published on your website. It has to meet that 72-hour deadline. If you published it by pasting it to the front doors, the glass doors, which I recommend, glass doors facing out so people can see it 24/7. That's the best practice. There's also behind the little glass doors inside. Inside the building, but on the website, if it doesn't get uploaded 72 hours, guess what? You got a delay. The other thing you've got to think about is where else you're publishing it so the public sees. So that's a little bit of governing body discretion, which goes into your Open Meetings Act notice. Just a question, does anybody know if you passed an Open Meetings Act resolution for this year? Yes?
Here.
Great. Do you do it in July? Do you do it in January? It's all the statute requires is once a year. Some people do it on a fiscal year, some do it on a calendar
Or
year.
January.
In January, and that's fine, you're compliant with the law. Your Open Meetings Act resolution is where you have the opportunity to say where we're publishing our agendas, our notices of meetings and our agendas. So first and foremost, City Hall, great. That's the most important place to put it. Website, yes. And then questions of, are there other places in the community where they should be? Some municipalities, depending on the number of buildings they have, will say we've posted in every building. Right? I'm not saying you have to, but you should think about where you want to post them so that the public sees it. I've had some municipalities posted at their one grocery store. Right? When you're a small enough town, there's one grocery store and everybody goes there every week. Great, grocery store owner loves it. The other thing you're required to do with publishing your notices and agendas is to send them to all media outlets that have requested copies of your notices and agenda. If they've specifically made a request for your notices, then you're obligated to send them out to those media outlets. What I do, and I hit best practices in a minute here, like I've said before. Heck, now with emails, you're not stuffing envelopes, you're not driving them around. Throw as many names as you want in there. Some governing bodies have set up what's called a community email. And it's anyone in the community that's asked to have the agenda emailed to them, because it's one click of a button and it goes out to everybody. So, and you might be doing that.
Yeah.
You might be doing that. So you're going to check mark off a lot of the best practices that we're talking about. Your Open Meetings Act resolution, make sure you pass them every year. And Steve, I've got a form that's open to everybody. I did a comprehensive rewrite because the AG's office hasn't updated their form since 2015. I just did a comprehensive post-COVID rewrite. If you make if you send me an email, I can send that out to you for next year, because that needs to be updated. Okay, emergency meetings. Yes, question. Oh, well, no, I actually I defer to the mayor because as the is who governs this meeting. So I don't know if you're recognizing questions off of the council or how you proceed.
Send someone text me that there's no sound or video coming up.
Yeah, she's working on that right now.
We know.
Oh, thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay,
That will allow.
okay. That sounds good. Should I pause for a moment?
No, I don't think we can get it back up.
I can't get it back up right now.
Okay. Okay. Believe it or not an issue with all the members present. If the members were attending virtually, some of the past guidance has been you've got to stop the meeting until the sound can be revived, but that's when the members are attending virtually. Okay. So where are we? Emergency meetings. All right, so 72 hours in advance. Somebody forgot to submit the food contract for the senior center, just forgot. And the next morning, oh my goodness, here it is. I need to get that on the agenda. And as I've said before, you can't amend within 72 hours. I do advise that you can delete by using strike through so that the community doesn't show up for something that's not going to be heard. But you still leave it on there with strike through and say postponed. But you can't add any. It's an emergency. I need food. I need to sign this contract. Emergency meetings now are very specifically defined in the Open Meetings Act, and I will tell you 99.5, not 99.9, but 99.5% of the time, it's not an emergency. And the reason I actually tell my governing bodies you should generally ignore it is because it's such a high standard. It must be for unforeseen circumstances that will likely result in injury or damage to persons or property or substantial financial loss. I've had it happen twice in the last decade. Here's the high threshold. You have to send notice to the AG, the Attorney General's office, as to why you're calling an emergency meeting. You have to share the agenda. When the minutes are ready, you have to share that. Now you're going to be meeting within 72 hours. Within 10 days, you've got to submit all that to the AG's office. They can take a while to review it. And if they say, no, that wasn't an emergency, guess what happens? Your decision is unraveled. Any decision was invalid. And now you got to go back and schedule a meeting, which you can do with a special meeting with 72 hours notice. You have to schedule another meeting and re-vote on it. Meanwhile, you've lost months. It goes to high profile status because the AG got involved and ruled against you, all of those things. So when you have the ability to call a special meeting within 72 hours, probably best to go that route rather than to designate it an emergency meeting. Now, the two instances I've had for emergencies, I share them. We had unbelievably cold weather up north with a governmental entity, frozen pipes, frozen water pipes. We had natural gas lines freeze, all of those things, and children were involved, and there was no way to be able to accommodate that. It was a school district. And so the governing body had to come together, have an emergency meeting to deal with all of that, how to protect the health and safety of the children. Submitted it to the AG's office, it was fine. We had another one where school was the next day and some electrical lines, there were leaks, puddles of water, electrical lines near the puddles of water, etc. Dangerous condition again for kids. We met, we submitted it to the AG's office, they approved it. But I've also seen where the AG's office hasn't approved it, and it's much more of a pain when they don't. So few and far between, ignore it. But if you feel you reach that threshold, A lot of times you're going to hear me say this throughout this presentation, consult your city attorney. I've known, I knew Steve Dorr before he had silver hair. So we go way back.
That's a long time ago.
That's a long time ago. So we go way back. His engagement to help you through these issues. You're gonna hear it on Open Meetings Act, you're gonna hear it on IPRA, even Governmental Conduct Act. You have a city attorney, use them the way you need to. Public comment. I could not find in your code your process for, not your process, but any requirements for your agenda or your, and look, I know I probably missed that, but for public comment period during meetings. Interestingly enough, the Open Meetings Act does not require a public comment session at your meetings. But it is a best practice, and most all governmental entities do it. I call it a pressure valve. The longer you keep the public quiet and push them away from you, the more the pressure builds up and it pops out somewhere. Public comment has lots of value. Number one, you hear the opinions of the community right here in your meeting. Number two, you allow that pressure to release. I've had governing bodies pull me aside and say, I really don't want to hear from that person right there. They come in, rattle our cage. You know, we never do anything right in their eyes. And I say, it's 3 minutes. It's 3 minutes. Let them get up, let them say their piece, and let them move on. Right? So public comment is that pressure valve, number one. Number two, most importantly, you hear from the constituency directly. And again, it's not required by law, but there have been bills introduced throughout the years that try and mandate it. I've never seen them really gain traction. I think someday it'll actually happen. But I think through different governing bodies, it tends to be a tradition, something recognized either in ordinance or policy or governing body handbooks, etc. So I'm a big proponent of the public comment period. It's got a lot of value. And I'll talk about best practices with it in a moment. All right, next slide. So you're going to hear from me, and you've heard the words reasonable specificity from me before. Remember how we're about transparency now and conducting business in front of the public, and the public needs the most information about what we're doing. Where the AG's office stings our governing bodies is when they're not reasonably specific in their description of the business that's being discussed or transacted. So biggest example that I've seen on an agenda item 5, contracts. That's it. That's it. That's all that's on the agenda. If we think about the person that's not overly involved in government, but they're looking at an agenda online, they're going to have no idea what that's talking about. Is it a food service contract? Is it a paving contract? Is it an audit contract? What kind of contract? Who's it with? What's the size of it, right? And so with that governing body, I worked with them and said, okay, well, maybe you don't want a 10-page agenda because you're listing all the contracts. Contracts is listed in Exhibit A to the agenda, and you publish it with the agenda. And contract number 1 is food service with XYZ food service provider, $50,000, etc. Boom, 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 boom. There's not a lot of requirements on that, but it's the reasonable specificity. So who are you doing business with? At the very least, maybe it doesn't have to have the amounts in it, but there's a point when you'll know it's too vague. So reasonable specificity, make sure the public's aware of what you're doing. Something that gets overlooked, and again, if you've got folks looking for you to trip, sometimes we trip over our minutes. Sometimes we trip, our staff is bogged down. Everyone's doing 10 jobs now, right? So getting to those minutes, that might take a back burner on the things right in front of me. Well, if someone's looking for you to trip, they also look at the minutes requirements under the Open Meetings Act. Number one, policy making body, here the council shall keep written minutes of all of its meetings, including date, time, place, names of the members in attendance, those absent, substance of the proposals considered, and a record of votes. Right, those are the basics. Notice it does not say they're verbatim. They can be summary notes, but they've got to be representative of what you're talking about and be a good record of what action actually took place. Here's where people trip. Minutes shall be prepared within 10 days. That's a big one. Not everyone's aware of that. They need to be prepared within 10 days. Now I get a hand raised at this point because, whoa, wait a second, but they're just drafts. And the board hasn't approved them. And what if the statement's wrong? What if it needs to be corrected? Mark them draft. Mark them draft, not approved by the governing body. Put that disclaimer on it. Someone may ask you it on that 10th day or day 11. Hey, the statute says I get to review the minutes. So they need to be prepared within 10 days of the meeting. And then shall be approved at the next meeting with a quorum and are not official until approved by the policymaking body. The thing that's swirly in there is the special meetings, right? So if we have a regular meeting today and we have a special meeting tomorrow, is that saying that I have to have the meetings ready and approved at the next day's meeting? It's not clear under the Open Meetings Act. I advise that really just have everything in order by your next regular meeting. At each regular meeting, you should be doing your best. Well, one, you should be adopting the minutes of the previous regular meeting. And any special meetings in between, you should be doing your best to get those approved at the next regular meeting. AG's office doesn't come down too hard on the special meetings aspect because they're unplanned, they're unscheduled. But where they do come down hard, and it shows up in everyone's agenda and every governing body's agenda, we read ourselves out. Approval of the minutes for February, March, April, May, June, July. You ever seen that on an agenda? Yeah. That would be in violation of the Open Meetings Act. And that's where someone that's waiting for you to trip goes, you tripped. Right? So a lot to keep in mind. Tough for staff, a big burden on staff, but it's there. So who enforces the Open Meetings Act? It's the Attorney General, more 99% of the time, 99.9% of the time, if not 100. I've never seen a DA, district attorney, get involved, but it's the AG's office. That's who sends the letter and says, we received a complaint. Here's a copy of the complaint. We are going to need all of your medical examinations for the last 10 years. It's pretty comprehensive when they ask for, all right, I need agenda items. I need all of these. I need past agendas. I need all the information related to the agenda item, et cetera. It's a pretty comprehensive inquiry by the AG's office that always has lawyers involved. And that gets expensive for an entity. It's cheaper to comply than it is to not comply and then have these inquiries. Any questions on this slide? From the governing body? Okay, so moving on. actually go back real quick. It gets expensive because there can be fines, attorney's fees and costs, etc. If someone files a lawsuit to enforce this, and you don't want that. So like I said, compliance is easier. All right, next slide. The recent issues, we've talked about them, vague agenda items, executive session placeholders, discussions during a recess, meeting requirements. Enforcement of public comment rules. I want to talk about this. And that is the following. Again, nothing's in statute. But you're going to have folks trying to ding you if you treat people unequally. So the best practices for public comment is to treat everyone equal. And that means that there's really not an opportunity for cutting off at a particular number. Because that's saying only the first 20 people get to comment and the other 40 in the room that want to comment don't. People will play games with that. The first 20 will line up all on one issue. And the other side of the issue don't get heard. That's one risk. And others. Is that a burden on the governing body? You've got to transact business? Yes, but you have other adjustments you can make. Number one, first and foremost, start with you should have a uniform time for public comment. Whether that's 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 30 minutes, uniform, right? By the way, I don't recommend 30 minutes per person. But I've seen a lot of 3 minutes out there. With discretion in the chair, mayor in this instance, to be able to say, wow, we've got a lot of people here. We need to make a decision. We're going to need, for everyone to be heard, we're going to need to shorten this to 1 minute per person or 2 minutes per person. And we ask that staff run a timer or someone, sometimes it's the governing body secretary runs a timer. Beep, beep, beep at 2 minutes, people are usually pretty respectful and they wrap up in 2 minutes. But everyone be given the same amount of time and everyone that needs to be heard, be allowed to be heard. I've seen some governing bodies require people to fill in the sign-in sheet prior to the meeting. That's all fine. Again, there's no statute around public comment, but make sure the structure applies equally to everybody and doesn't prefer one perspective over another perspective, because that's where things get difficult. Make sense? Make sense on governing body? Great. On public comment. Properly posted meeting notices and not getting posted on time, as we've talked about, other recent issues. A pattern of rescheduled or postponed meetings. I will also add to that a pattern of special meetings. AG's office has stepped in a couple of times on those. So number one, if your regular meeting month in and month out is always rescheduled, it's not a regular meeting, right? No one's adhering to that regular meeting schedule. And the AG's office has stepped in and said, hey, the public expects you to be on the 2nd and the 4th Tuesday of the month, and it's never there. And sometimes it's a Thursday, sometimes it's a Friday, sometimes it's Monday night. The public can't plan ahead to participate and be present. So the AG's office will step in if there's a pattern of constantly rescheduled or postponed meetings. Number one. Number two, I've had governmental entities step in, for you it would be local government division, and say, you know what, I'm seeing a real high pattern of special meetings. Is it because you need to meet specially? I'm not talking about this governmental entity, but I have a specific governmental entity in mind in a small community that realize, boy, if we schedule 4 special meetings per month, we get 4 more per diems per month, right? Pretty crafty, pretty creative. The governing agency will step in at that point in time. Local government division or public education division for school district. So be careful of those. And all of this is to avoid a couple of things. Well, number one, attorney general inquiries, like I've talked about, because they're expensive, because the lawyers have to be involved, because staff has to be involved, and that's downtime. That's just adding one more thing to staff to answer all these inquiries from the AG's office. And it's costly in public opinion. Going back to what I talked about at the beginning, if the public loses trust because Open Meetings Act isn't being followed, then they're painting the rest of the city with that. All right. Any questions so far? Last open meetings slide, I think, one or two. OMA post-COVID. Some governmental entities are still doing virtual meetings. Is the governing body doing virtual meetings anymore where the members are remote? Okay. Believe it or not, the statutes haven't been revised to allow for that. The statute from pre-COVID times says the members are to be present and remote attendance by telephone. The drafters weren't aware of video conferencing at the time. Being remotely available is to be unusual and not regular under the statute. That's the statute that's still current. Post-COVID, a lot of our governing bodies are gravitating back to the in-person meetings, but we still have some doing remote meetings. If you do have remote attendance, then the members have to verbally identify themselves during the meeting and make sure they're identified, typically through Zoom or Teams or Google Meets. You're going to have your name there. So that the members have to be identifiable. The public must be able to also have the remote access. And if you have someone, a governing body member attending remotely, then all votes must be by roll call vote at that point. And as I talked about earlier, if the audio or video is interrupted, then the chair should suspend the discussion until it's operational again. Again, that's when your governing body members are attending remote. And this was all guidance during the public health emergency. That's gone away. Those public health orders no longer exist. So this is supposed to sort of fade into the distance. Next slide. Thank you. Best practices. What I'm seeing works best for our municipalities. All agendas for the next week publish on Friday at 5 p.m. It gives a lot, one, for staff. It's a little easier to organize. There's one click, all the agendas go out, they get posted, etc. Not saying everyone has to do this. The statute says 72 hours in advance. But I've seen a lot of municipalities say, everybody's agenda in by Wednesday. Let's review them. Let's publish them on Friday, whether your meeting's Monday through Friday of the following week. Procedurally, it seems to be a little bit smoother. Including copies of the council packet online is not required under the Open Meetings Act. However, for a few good reasons, it's a best practice. One, transparency. So those contracts we talked about, sometimes that's in your packet, posted online. Why? One, transparency to the public. See what contracts getting approved, what the amount is. But two, for staff, it cuts down on the number of Inspection of Public Records Act requests. Because it's online. You get to point to that. Nobody has to make a request. No staff member has to track it for 3 days and then 15 days and produce it. You just get to point everyone to the website. Number two, governing body members, have you ever experienced really bad rumors going on in the community that are absolutely false? Yeah, all the time.
Every day.
When the packet's online, facts are online. Well, I heard that you're going with someone from out of state and you're paying them 5 times the last contract, you're paying them $10 million to provide food service. No. Look at the contract that's online. It's to this vendor within the county, and it's at $20,000, right? So you get to sort of point to that. So it's very helpful in that way. It helps get rid of rumors. It helps the public just be aware of what's going on, because sometimes in public comment, people will come up, they're going to guess what you're talking about on these agenda items instead of see what's actually in the agenda item. So I didn't see packets posted. They might be, but
Ours are not posted online yet, but
now there are confidential items in packets. You don't have to post the confidential items. Like a legal memo that's going to be discussed in executive session. You certainly wouldn't want to post that. But you'll see other things that you'll know it when you see it on the agenda, those things that, hey, if the public knows, great. They're just that much more aware. So where am I? Public meeting notice agendas, copies of the packet, additions only noted, deletions within 72 hours. Sometimes I repeat myself, ask my wife. Include public comments. We've talked about most all of this. We advise using a script. And again, Steve got copies of different scripts we've prepared for folks. Let's read the guidelines. You have 3 minutes. You will be timed. Please keep your topics to things that pertain to the governing body, that relate to our business. Someone goes off on a rail, remember it's only 2 or 3 minutes, but here's the amount of time. Try and speak civilly. Don't bring up confidential personnel information. Our school district scripts say don't bring up confidential student information, right? But it's a nice little guideline that gets read every meeting at the beginning of public comment, and then first one. Great, everybody knows the ground rules. So that really helps maintain decorum for public comment period. That covers that. Next slide. Okay, no rolling forums. I put it as the first bullet point and the last bullet point because that's where people get tripped up. And I put an exclamation point. So, I won't go through it again, but that is the biggest ding and the most frequent ding. Specific language we talked about, post your minutes. Even in draft form, just mark them that way. And just put as much as you can in open session. And what we've learned from COVID is continue taping or live streaming. You're doing it. What a great practice this is. That you've got the live streaming going for all those folks that have to make dinner for their kids or take care of their parents or something of that sort. They not only get to watch it live, but we also recommend keeping the video and posting it on a page with a link where people can see it. Because they may not be able to do it right this moment, but they can click it later. Here's another benefit to the governing body. Another silly question. You ever been misquoted by a member of the public or the media? Yeah, not intentionally by the media. I know the media is present. I'm not trying to paint them as anyone is a bad guy, but hey, words matter, and sometimes we don't capture the words right, or the rumor mill starts going, and that telephone game that says, oh, I'm in favor of this, and by the time they call 15 friends, the governing body member was somehow opposed to this measure. What the tape does is it preserves a record that you can point to. It says, no, the rumor mill says I was against this. Let me point you to minute 42 on the video, and you will see I clearly state I support this. So it brings that clarity. And by the way, for it actually, it's also a benefit for the media too, because not always can the media be present. They are on a deadline. They can listen to a meeting remotely. Or there's a note that says, I missed part of the quote. Now I can go back to the video and get the quote right. Right? So a lot of benefits for the community, for the governing board, for the reporting of what your business is. So continue that. I don't think that practice is going to go away, but the permanently posting online is highly recommended. Not everyone does that. Great, next slide. All right. Well, I don't see a lot of closed eyes, so that's good. If you thought the Open Meetings Act was exciting, now we're at the Inspection of Public Records Act. Right? How am I doing on time? I'm at 45 minutes. Okay. Inspection of Public Records Act. This is just as important for the staff and the community as it is for the governing body. Again, these transparency laws that have developed over the last 40 to 50 years and developed constantly through case law. It's important to know it's the same thing. The public is entitled to the maximum information possible. So it's not only attending your meetings, but it's access to the records of governmental entities. And so with Inspection of Public Records Act, again, public has a right to inspect public records except for limited exclusions. And there's a set of them. I'm not really going to get into the exclusions. The general rule is everything's a public record. And then within statute, there are very important protections. Student information, health information, certain personnel information, attorney-client communications, all of those things get recognized as protected records. But the general rule for all our purposes is act as if the record is going to be public at some point in time, right? And so public's got the right to access a lot of information. And those types of records include emails, texts, pictures, videos, draft documents within the possession of the governmental entity. Again, subject to certain exceptions. And so just treat everything as typically a public record. I want to give you an example, and sometimes it doesn't matter where that's located. So I have this great example. It was a college up north, very difficult constituent, was coming into the college president's office all the time and really, really giving staff a tough time. And this individual was having a really bad day, comes in, starts yelling and screaming at a staff member. The staff member is trying to calm him down, trying to get him to leave. And the staff member decided, I'm going to video record your activity, right? Because this isn't acceptable. I'm alone. I don't feel safe. And I want to be able to tell someone how they're. So they pulled out their personal cell phone and recorded this constituent yelling and screaming, which I think was actually a good practice to record what was happening versus, words versus words as to what happened. That constituent made an IPRA request, Inspection of Public Records Act, IPRA for short. That individual made an IPRA request for that video. The employee's first reaction was, no, that's my personal phone. I used my personal phone to do this. And the real legal analysis was you were performing your duties during the weekday on the governmental site and you recorded this video. And so, yes, it is a record, and that record needs to be produced over. Now, some folks may think that's terrible. I think for the situation, that was good that it was preserved. Here's your activity. You want to IPRA how you were acting, or you want to take that to a lawyer to see if you have a lawsuit? Great, take that video. But that's an example that we may not think about, that we may have created a public record. The emails on city email system, yeah, that's pretty obvious. Text relating to city business, pretty obvious. Pictures, whether they're taken individually or as part of my job in public works. I go and I take pictures of damage to the streets or to a drainage inlet or something of that sort. And a member of the public says, hey, did you take pictures? I want copies. They get to do things like that. So that's a little bit more obvious. Where am I going with all of that? So just be aware that the business we conduct, the public may have access to it. And there's no exclusion for whether or not you're conducting business on a city email or on a personal email, Gmail, for example. Again, I was city attorney for 4 years up in Santa Fe. I've been aware of all of these things. Small enough community, people know my Gmail address. Hey, Gino, what about this housing project? I would forward that to my official email and respond back from my official email. Or when I was forwarding saying, hey, you contacted me on my personal email, I'm forwarding it to my official email and I'll respond from there. And then you respond from that. What does that do? It preserves it on the public side and it avoids search as a personal email. And the reverse is true. For governing body members, I wouldn't be shocked if any of you have gotten a personal email on your governing body. Hey, come to this fundraiser on Thursday at such and such a place. I do the reverse. I received those emails when I was city attorney. I did the reverse. I'm forwarding this to my personal email and we'll continue this conversation there. And then on the Gmail, hey, great, I want to go to that political function on Saturday. Look forward to seeing you then. Okay, so start shifting. Where I get a lot of pushback from governing body members is their use of their personal email for public business. Why? It's easier. I check all my emails on my business email. I'm retired. I check all my emails on Gmail. I don't want to have to log in here. When you start meshing those, then you're opening up your private emails to search. The other problem is, and this is a procedural thing, when the city gets IPRA request for emails, IT just has to go to the email server and pull them up. But if they're on your Gmail, if they're on your private email, that doesn't happen. They've got to go, this is a procedure I implemented with city councilors when I was city attorney. IT has got to go sit next to you, log into your Gmail, let's run a text search and let's see what pops up, right? And now we need to go through those emails. See how intrusive that is? See how we don't really want to do that and why it's better to, number one, use your official governmental email for official business. And number two, segregate your information out. Send private to private, send public to public. Make sense? Great. Okay, timelines. To conserve time, I don't want to get in the biggest of details, but again, for staff, for governing body members, IPRA has very strict timeframes for answering and providing documents. And where we run into problems and where we as a governmental entity get into issues about compliance is when the deadlines are ignored. And so, wow, I got, for the administrator, for the records custodian, that might be their 5th of 5 duties they're assigned. I got to get this done for the city manager and this for the department director. And then I'm also the board's administrator. And then I have to answer IPRA. You know what? I'll put IPRA off to the side. You violate the deadlines, you're open to legal fees and daily fines and all of these things. IPRA actually has to go the reverse. That's got to be the one immovable duty. The IPRA deadline has to take precedence over every other assignment. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is supporting your public records custodian. and empowering the records custodian. I'll say it in front of staff. With the ability to put fear in the eyes of everybody else. Because if they don't, it falls to the wayside. I don't know how much work everybody's got on their plate. So it falls to the wayside, and then you send a request for records out to a department director, and 15 days later, there's no response. That's going to be a problem for the city as a whole. Next page, well, penalties before we get to the next page. Again, enforcement by the attorney general or the district attorney, almost never see that. The difference is the public can enforce this themselves. The person who made the request, if you don't comply with the request, then the private individual gets to sue. And they get fees, penalties, their attorney's fees, et cetera. So, and it gets expensive. So next slide. There's IPRA case law out there. Britain versus Office of the Attorney General, Libet versus UNM Foundation, ACLU versus Duran. All of these, the case law really doesn't help governmental entities. I know a judge, a retired judge, who is now chair of a governing body subject to IPRA and OMA. I wish that retired judge was chair of a governing body before they became judge. Because nobody understands all the restrictions of IPRA and OMA till they're subject to them and how restrictive they are. Our appellate courts almost never decide in favor of governmental body if the governmental body is tripped and not followed the law completely. So, our takeaways are that from the Britain case is that we need trained records custodians with comprehensive procedures. We had a lawsuit. Someone sued over IPRA, and we asked the records custodian, did you gather all the documents they requested? Yes. Did you provide them over? Yes. Right, and we believe that records custodian. Okay, show me what you gather. I don't have it. Why? Because I produced them over. Did you keep copies? No. And we couldn't prove compliance. So now a lot of things that we coach, it's very detailed. The records custodian, what were your search terms? How many documents did you find? 1,000. Of the 1,000, how many were actually in the scope of the request? 100. Okay, great. How many were protected from disclosure? 50. How many did you provide over? 50. Great. Preserve each one of those steps, because if you ever go before a judge and they want to see that you took this request seriously, here are our search terms. Here's what we found. Here's what we narrowed it down to. Here's what was protected. Here are copies, judge, because the judge can see them, of what was protected. And here's what we produced. And now that's a really good defense for someone who's trying to play gotcha. And I'm going to go through some explanations, but why people play gotchas on the next line. Libet doesn't really apply here, but ACLU does. Because in that instance, somebody possessed a document from the governmental entity. Here, the Secretary of State's office. They had it in their possession, but they didn't know if it was actual and genuine. So they IPRA'd the Secretary of State's office for that document. Secretary of State's office, for whatever reason, didn't produce it. That was a violation of IPRA because, well, we knew it existed. We have a copy, but you didn't produce it to me. And the court said, whether or not they have a copy in their possession, you're still obligated to produce it. And if we go to the next page, here are the numbers. $130,000 paid by the Secretary of State's office in that case for not producing one piece of paper. Right? 90,000 against Oneida County for not complying with IMBRA. Almost 400,000 awarded against the governor's office. Not the current administration, if anyone was curious, but past administrations. But every governor's office is susceptible to this. So these, sometimes when you start seeing fees like this, then you understand, okay, if we need to put good, solid systems in place, we need to improve our practices so that people can search our emails and find the documents, and then put the support into both the moral support and the financial support into the records custodian to comply. Any questions on IPRA so far? Is this making sense? Great. Next. Thank you. So what can we do about them? We've talked about it. Help the records custodian, give them the resources and staffing, give them the training they need. The AG's office used to provide statewide training. Municipal League now is doing some trainings, and I end up doing some of them, which is a good thing because I love it. But training for your records custodian so they're up to speed, have the best practices in place. Access to the legal counsel. There should be the ability for direct access between the records custodian and the city attorney. I highly recommend it. When I was in the city of Santa Fe, it makes sense. When I started there, the records custodian was in the clerk's office. And that can work. The difficulty at the city of Santa Fe was we were physically separated across the building, but physically separated, number one, and records custodian was the fifth of 5 duties. We actually moved the records custodian into the city attorney's office so that, we were spoiled. We had lots of attorneys. We were of the size that we had 7 attorneys, including myself. But we put the records custodian next to the attorney that specialized in it. Hey, I have a question. Hey, can you draft this? Does my letter look right? Is my search right? What else do we need to do? So they were incredibly close. So empowering your records custodian, giving them access, direct access to legal counsel. What used to be a 1-sentence response letter in IPRA that says, you made a request, here are your responsive documents, has now grown into a 2-page letter. Because of all of these lawsuits, we have to say, thank you for your response. We understand your response to be the following. We use the following search terms. We found X number of documents. This many apply to your request. This many are exempt or protected from disclosure under this line of the law. And here's the number of documents that you receive under IPRA. Because we're not just playing for the respondent, if we get to court, we want to show the judge and the jury, hey, we took this seriously and we were diligent and we did our best. Nobody's perfect, but we really tried our hardest to get this done. So that's the important takeaway with IPRA, to protect your governing body, your entity, is to have a good IPRA process in place. Next, please. Best practices. We've talked about them. Always use your city email for city business, and always use your personal email for personal business. So if you have a city cell phone, use it for city business. By the way, and I don't want to scare staff. I don't want to overly scare staff. If you've got a personal cell phone, somebody calls you business related. One, the odds of a search of most things are pretty low, but number 2, okay, was there a business conversation on this date between 2 people? Yeah, here it was. And it's pretty much over with at that point in time. Where the difficulty is maybe if there's a conflict of interest or something that's gonna violate the law in other ways. If that call is necessary, thanks, folks. Now, where are we? Business written communications. This goes to everybody. Written communications, please keep them professional because they might be subject to IPRA. They might be. Here's my biggest example. I haven't used the word frequent flyers, but frequent flyers that come in, they actually know you're talking about or expect that you are. So if they come in and wreak havoc, you send an email to a coworker and say, oh, that person, whew, let me tell you, and here's what I think of that person, and here's what I think of their family, and here's what I think of their dog. Right? That's public business. You know what the frequent flyer does? Because I saw it happen. They do an IPRA, all emails mentioning my name. And then it gets produced, and then they provide it to the media. And I had a public works director front page above the fold in a local newspaper. Here's how they're talking about constituents in our community. So keep communications professional. Write like a third party is going to read your emails. Write like it's going to be front page above the fold. And the city should, again, and probably does happen, everyone's confined pretty well. Cities should have a centralized public records custodian with records as the primary duty. We talked about all of that. I had a fleeting thought that went by, but I'll let it go. Next slide. Ooh, this gets us to the Governmental Conduct Act. I'm trying, folks. Governmental Conduct Act. This one's really important because it applies to the governing body and staff. It really does. And it highlights the public officers, but it's also the employees. And that is, and we do this. I've worked with you. Everyone's doing their best at all times. We are required to treat our position as a public trust and use what we do through our powers and resources only to advance the public interest, not for personal benefits or to pursue private interests. We're working for the public good. And I know you're doing that, right? But again, people are looking for when we trip. We've got to conduct ourselves in a manner that justifies the confidence placed in us by the people. We are funded by the community, right? And we want them to have trust in us. We want them to have trust in the services that we provide. And to help do that, we need to fully disclose real or perceived, real or not perceived, I'm sorry, or potential conflicts of interest. And that shall be a guiding principle for determining appropriate conduct. This, again, it's the full disclosure of real or potential conflicts of interest being a guiding principle for determining appropriate conduct. This is where governing bodies get scrutinized, right? Am I voting on business that relates to my employer? Am I voting on business that relates to my spouse, my siblings, my in-laws? All common things that happen in our communities, right? We've got small communities. But this Governmental Conduct Act, by the way, it's a state statute. And for the last decade or so has applied to municipalities. Not always, but most recently, it's been applied to municipalities. That's got a lot of consequences to it. So it's this real or potential conflicts of interest. Examples, I had a governing body member that worked for the state highway department. And a paving some type of grant relating to the state highway department. Individual raise their hand, real or potential conflicts of interest, right? I work for the state highway department. This contract relates to what I do. I'm abstaining. Number one, the obligation is to publicly disclose the conflict in the meeting. And number two is to abstain from participation. And so that's a tough one. And there may be other potential conflicts. So I've talked about employers. I've talked about relationships. Again, these are times maybe in advance when we have an explicit agenda, these conflicts are coming, right? If there's a need to consult the city attorney to say, hey, is this something I should make a declaration on? Is this something I should abstain from? Do that, because again, people are looking or watching if you trip. And so pay attention to those. Other places that people get caught up on, and I'll use a school district example again, but it can happen in any municipality. A board member of the local YAFL voting on whether or not YAFL could use school football fields in the fall, or what rates, right? Potential for conflict. Yes, you're a board member. You have an interest in what the rates are and your financial viability in your charitable board membership. And so again, raise a conflict and abstain. So, and it all boils down to this: make reasonable efforts, and these are all requirements within the statute. You got to make reasonable efforts to avoid undue influence and abuse of office. I actually smile at this one, because I had a board member, a city council member in one of our communities, raise their hand. They did two things after this. They raised their hand and they said, I have a conflict with this particular agenda item, and I cannot participate in the vote. I'm going to abstain. Pretty good so far. And then finished with this, but I recommend that everybody approve it. And then the member stood up and sat in the first row and mad dogged everybody in the governing body meeting until they cast their vote. Right. So I add as a best practice, so no one can accuse you of undue influence when you've abstained. I abstain. I'm going to step out of the room for the rest of this. Not required. But I advise, step out of the room, grab some water, take a break. Because if you're in the room, someone else may interpret it and may report it as mad dogging or otherwise intending to influence the decision. Make sense? Okay. Next slide, please. Here's the one that's hard. Here's the one that's very difficult. And by the way, in addition to whatever experience I've talked to you about as a lawyer, I've been a candidate for office. And I've worked on campaigns for people in office. So for the governing body members who are elected, I know what you go through. And I know that there are landmines out there and that there are places to trip. So I've been on your side of the table, and these are pretty hard and they're pretty stringent when it comes to political activities. No coercion to contribute, vote, or participate in a political activity. This is where you got to be the most careful. Well, yeah, I talked to the person. I wasn't coercing them. It's actually more about the recipient, right? Did they feel coerced? It's a governing body. I guess it's a governing body member. It's a counselor. I can't say, no, I'm going to lose my job. Maybe I do need to go walk in that parade, right? So you got to be aware It's not really our intent as we communicate it, but it's how it's received. Right? That can mess with some of this stuff on the political activities. No threats to deny promotion or pay increase for failure to participate in political activities. No requiring employee contributions or purchasing of event tickets. And got to be careful. I didn't require it. I just suggested it. Right? But does the recipient then turn around and go, I sure felt coerced. Right? I felt like if I didn't go eat a Frito pie, I was going to lose my job. By the way, I would eat a Frito. If it's a choice between my job and a Frito pie, I'll pick the Frito. So, no advising employees to take part in political activities and then the obvious one, no use of governmental property for non-authorized purposes as it relates to political activities. So these ones are smile ones. Do not use, I'm using real examples, do not use a public works truck to put a campaign sign in the back and drive around town. We all agree on that one?
Yes.
Okay, good, it happened. No bumper stickers on governmental entities, political bumper stickers on governmental vehicles. No use of emails for political purposes. There's another one I've seen. Saw a sheriff do this. Hey, I'm having a fundraiser on Saturday to raise money for my campaign. County.gov email, right? No, that would be a violation of the government conduct. Right? You're using governmental resources for political activities. Now, there are some exceptions out there relating to use of facilities. If people can rent, if everyone, the whole public can rent certain facilities, say section of the park and it's open. There are some examples out there. I'm not really going to get too deep in that. There are some exceptions, but the general rules are don't use governmental resources for political purposes and for private purposes, right? I'm going to use a public works truck on Saturday to haul my landscaping materials, or in my sideline business that's landscaping, I'm going to borrow one of the dump trucks, right? Now, you can't, those are other examples outside the political realm. Official acts for personal financial interest are prohibited. Knowing and willful violation is a 4th degree felony. I described this one using real world examples. This is the cash in bags clause. Can't take official acts in exchange for cash in bags. It's happened, right? There are people wearing orange now that have done that. So I advise against that. Unless you're rooting for the Fort Sumner Foxes, you don't look good in orange, right? So, public employee or officer who is qualified from engaging in any official activity directly affecting their financial interests. This overlaps with what I talked about employers. If I'm taking votes and engaging in official acts that are going to benefit my employer, that keeps me employed, that is, has me employed because I'm taking these acts over here, that is going to be problematic, because at the very least, you're going to get a complaint that you are taking an official act to benefit yourself personally through your employer. Make sense? And that personal realm reaches out to a small range of family, which is typically parents, siblings, in-laws of each, children, right? There's that realm around you where you can step into it for taking official acts to benefit people within that realm around you. Okay? All right, next slide. We're on the home stretch, folks. As far as you know. Important provisions, no honoraria for speeches, services. We are representing someone that has an ethics complaint before the State Ethics Commission for violating this provision. Allegations that this provision is being violated. No honoraria for speeches or service relating to the performance of public duties. The expenses are okay. The local Chamber of Commerce invites you to come be the keynote speaker at their luncheon. It's fine. They're providing you lunch for free. That's fine. Hobbs Chamber of Commerce invites you to come down there. They're going to provide you lunch. They're going to provide you a hotel room overnight. That's fine. They want to give you a $500 check to thank you for coming down as mayor or councilor to provide that speech. Time out. That's honorary. You can't be paid for acting in your official duties. Okay. And people play cute with that. Well, I wasn't really in my official duties. Well, everything said you were here as city councilor, right? Your talk was about being a city councilor, right? So the honoraria provision is one that gets highly enforced, right? No use of confidential information for private gain. You learned something about selling city property in an executive session and you walk out and call your real estate agent and say you got to buy the plot right next to it. Nobody knows this. We've got to get it closed before this decision made. It's going to be a violation of Governmental Conflict Act if you're using confidential information for your personal gain. Same, this applies electeds and staff. I know I'm focusing on electeds. Enforcement provisions. Just updated this slide. It's enforced by the State Ethics Commission. And whose name appears in that complaint? The individual that's being complained against, right? And it becomes an official public record that there's a complaint against this individual. Now, some people try and weaponize that. I'm going to file a bunch of complaints just to besmirch someone's name, right? Well, the decisions that say, hey, this was a frivolous claim also gets published too, if it is a frivolous claim. But if it's not a frivolous claim, the decision of the Ethics Commission gets published if there's a violation. Number one. Number two, the Ethics Commission can refer egregious cases to the Attorney General or to a local district attorney. Back to cash and bags, right? So those things can get referred out. The Ethics Commission can somehow, depending on the different roles, deal with discipline, dismissal, demotion, suspension, and there's a word that's censure, etc. But then, of course, there are criminal penalties. 4th degree felony is the worst. Some are misdemeanors with up to $1,000 fines and 364 days in jail. There are civil penalties, and these can be imposed against the person. All of these fees and fines. So the individual for these violations. So civil penalties of $250 per violation up to $5,000. So some big consequences when it comes to the Governmental Conduct Act. And this applies to every governing body, let's talk about municipalities, every council and commission throughout the state. Okay, next slide. So avoid conflicts and improper actions with, avoid conflicts, period. Avoid improper actions with employees. Abstain from decisions affecting your personal financial interests. Remember, I said yourself, your family, your employer. Be careful with political campaigns. Public disclosure, I recommend as a best practice, public disclosures of financial interests, nonprofit memberships, other memberships, and gifts received. I've well, I'm gonna save this, but I've seen ethics ordinances that have requirements for those. But right now, for City of Santa Fe, I am on the Community Health and Safety Task Force. And this morning, I filled out my annual disclosure sheet that listed any charitable board memberships, any businesses I own. For the most part, that was it. And I signed it and submitted it. As a task force member, I'm not even on the governing body. All their boards and commissions through their ordinance, they're required to fill those out. Public disclosure, they're collected and they're posted publicly. So we know. So, oh, my employer, that was the other thing. So my employer, any charitable organizations and any businesses owned, right? And then I get to be held accountable if I'm not disclosing conflicts and I'm acting on something that benefits my employer, and the other entities I talked about. Does not require me to list my family members, and probably for privacy reasons. All right, next. Okay, this is where I go over the city's code of conduct that's in ordinance. You don't have one. You don't. Now, you got the Governmental Conduct Act. That's pretty strong in and of itself. But how do we police ourselves before it gets really big? A lot of municipalities do this through their own ordinance and code of conduct. It doesn't contradict the Governmental Conduct Act, but it also helps them catch things early. And it has typical code of conduct ordinances will have an ethics panel or some type of board or commission that reviews complaints and determines whether or not activities need to be corrected. And City of Santa Fe, for example, from governing body members on down the line to employees that can be reported for violations. And again, ethics panels will say, that was frivolous. No, that wasn't a violation. Or they will say, yeah, that was a violation. And here's how we correct it. And that's where censures come into play. A lot of those have that option. So they address disclosures, localized type of conflicts that may not apply statewide, process for reporting, an investigation, and an ethics panel to then review that. Okay, so something to consider. Again, you have the backstop of the Governmental Conduct Act. Next slide. But I did go through your city ordinances because where do governing bodies get tripped up? When it's not all those other issues that I talked about, what's the next issue? And we do this presentation in all our communities because it's a common occurrence. The governing body gets tripped up on what's within its authority and what's outside its authority. Right. So I like to say it this way. How many, according to your ordinances, as far as I saw, how many employees does the governing body have? One. Under your ordinances, city managers got everybody else, right? And that is constant conflict in all our communities. Because governing body members go, oh, but this person and but that person. And it's two ways. It's this person should be hired, this person should be out. This person is the one I think is most qualified. And this person I went to grade school with, all of the above, right? So that's where we trip over ourselves. And that's where we have a lot of risk, right? Because your ordinances define you have one employee. But if we're dealing with 30 employees from a governing body level, then we're not complying with our ordinances. We're violating our own laws. And then employees or former employees or non-hired potential employees, that's where they step in, right? I was the highest qualified candidate, but I didn't get the job. Insert reason here. And if the governing body's involved in that, right? If the city manager's hiring and not hiring or firing and not firing, guess whose name's on that lawsuit? City manager. The governing body starts reaching over and getting involved. Guess who's on that lawsuit? The governing body member. Right? And then there's a whole host of risks over there. If there were intentional violations of the law, then you get questions of coverage and all of those things, right? And those are conversations we don't ever want to have. So when we're in our lane and we're overseeing a city manager and the city manager is in charge of everybody else, then okay, we're in our lane. And we're doing the role of the governing body. And same for the city manager, right? By the way, that's a two-way street with confusion. Sometimes city managers also want to be governing body members, right? I've had a series of communities where really the governing body member would rather be the city manager. And sometimes the city manager would really rather be the mayor or the councilor, right? And it gets confusing on all these roles. And then when it gets down to staff, then we open ourselves up for a whole host of things. So what's in your ordinances? City council employs and removes the city manager. Period, right? City manager is appointed by this as, a typo there, as appointed by the city council as the chief administrative officer of the city. Section 2-57, based on administrative qualifications and salary fixed by the city council. So there's discretion for the governing body there. How much is paid? What are the best qualities? What are the qualifications we need at this moment in time for city manager? There's a lot of discretion. But then we get to city manager. City manager shall employ and discharge all persons engaged in the administrative service of the city. So governing body, one employee, city manager, everybody else, right? And city attorneys are that one exception. Some communities, those are contracted, like here in Portales. Others, they're an employee of the city. And so other cities will have two employees, city attorney, city manager. Others will have city clerk, city manager, city attorney, all as direct reports to the council and the council selection. But here, and this is what our code says, right? And in section 19-25, the city manager has sole authority to employ and discharge all municipal employees. Here's something that's fresh. We just had this happen with another governing body. Governing body member doesn't go through the chief executive, but to a department head. Says, hey, I hear you're putting together a hiring committee. It's a governing body member. I'd like to be on that hiring committee. And so where's our problem? Two problems. No matter who you grew up with, how friendly you've been, whose cousin you are, you're always a governing body member. Always. It's like a cloak, a Superman's cloak that you just can't shed. Everyone's always going to perceive you that way. And if you're on that hiring committee, people are going to listen to you a little bit more than they might listen to everybody else. And people might be nervous. Say, oh, I don't know. I don't want to jeopardize my job. I don't want to get crosswise with that governing body member. I guess I'm going to vote with them wherever they want to head on this hiring committee. Number one. Number two, it's violating the sole authority to employ and discharge because now you're participating in the hiring and firing process. Now, I'm not saying that's happening here. I'm saying that's an example that's fresh on my mind because we just dealt with that in another governing body. Governing body members should not be on hiring committees. Okay. But where does the council have some authority? Because you've got a personnel policy that's in ordinance. You have authority over the ordinances. And so your policies, your personnel policy, you should be looking at refreshing, updating, modernizing to recruit and retain effective employees. And for that small number that needs to move on, to help move them on and help them move on sometimes. That's where the governing bodies got some discretion and some authority, is updating and revising the personnel policy. Because the problem is, if we're violating the governing body's role and the city manager's role, and then our own personnel policy, right? We're opening up the community, the governing body to liability. Okay. So. Important slide, take it to all my governing bodies because this is where there's a lot of difficulty. All right, the next slide. Everybody's favorite slide. Any questions? I mean, concluded the presentation here. We've reviewed the Open Meetings Act, Inspection of Public Record, Governmental Conduct Act, city ordinances. I forgot to take off charter from the last communities. But it's a lot. This is a lot. And this is why it's important for the self-insured fund to send me down to communities to assist them, to provide training, guidance, updates, reminders, all of the above. Because ultimately it helps keep the governing body focused on the business and the authority of the governing body. So that, again, when you're acting appropriately, you're getting the business done, you're building confidence in the community, and it's reinforcing the skills of the staff on the ground and the effectiveness of the staff on the ground. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
Appreciate you being here, knowing, and I just want to reiterate that this is something that this council needs to be trained on. And we appreciate you coming down and giving us some training. Hopefully it'll be something that we do every couple of years and really should be required to do that. And I think we are. We normally have done it after newly elected officials, but with COVID coming in, we've missed a few years.
Right.
Anyway,
We've had a governing body that in their ethics ordinance required this type of presentation every year at a specific time. And typically it was right after an election when new members were coming on. And it required the city attorney to make this presentation. I'll tell you, between me and Steve, one of us is smarter, and it's not me. He can do this presentation, and he can do this on an annual basis. And so those are things to think about, and I think that's a great practice to do this at regular intervals. The other recommendation I do make is that the governing body posts this presentation each year when it's done on their governing body site. Not only as a reminder to the governing body, but a reminder to the staff of what everyone's roles and limitations are, and a reminder to the community. So when that person knocks, taps you on the shoulder in the grocery store and says, hey, I need you to go fire this person over there. It's a reminder of, hey, my roles are here. City manager's roles are here. These folks, the staff's roles are over here. In community, you need to be aware of that because the community is the one that's oftentimes the least aware and have expectations for folks to go outside their life. Yes, sir.
You know that Municipal League has every year that there's election, and they have a deal in the. Well, they can tell you all what you told us right now.
This
Yes, sir.
newly affected, our newly elected official.
Yes,
Jake,
sir.
You're absolutely right. I used to do it by district or by different areas.
Councilman Lopez is right. I mean, some of us just got back from our annual conference and a lot of this was covered, but not everybody can make those.
Right.
you know, for whatever reason, they can't always make the newly elected officials. So I appreciate, you know, that you here and.
Thank you.
and,
Mayor, Councilor Lopez. Thank you for pointing that out. It's really important that the municipal league provides that at their conferences. And then these additional ones add to it because the staff's not at those conferences and your community is not at those conferences. And I'll go back to a political example. It's your elected officials. There's this old saying that unless you and everyone around you is tired of your stump speech, you're not doing it right. Right? The repetitive nature, hearing it over and hearing it over. That's what helps settles it in and keep us on the right track. So all of these techniques of hearing it several times.
Even if you already know, I think you need to go every time that everything comes up like that. Because you always learn something.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Ms. Parker.
Well, thank you for being here. We appreciate it very much. Great information.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask a couple of clarifying questions?
Sure.
So on the Open Meetings Act, I was able to go to that training last week. It says in your presentation, you must report to the Attorney General if you have a special, an emergency meeting within 10 days.
Right.
We were told in that meeting that if it's an emergency, you know, God forbid, kind of like the Las Vegas fires, and you know that the emergency is going to go over the 10 days.
Right.
They're already aware. I just don't want to put us in a predicament. God forbid we ever have something like that and we don't.
Mayor, Councilor Cordova, let me clarify any misunderstanding in my language. An emergency meeting is any meeting that takes place without 72 hours notice, shorter than 72 hours. You can hold the meeting. You must report that you had the meeting within 10 days. And then the AG's office will opine as to whether that was appropriate. And maybe, I haven't dealt with an instance like the fires, but I can see multiple emergency meetings and either each time reporting them, or if you're going to have 5 in the first 5 days, you still have 5 days to report those all. Maybe you do one report that says we had these emergency meetings on the first day, second day, third day, fourth day for these reasons. And so that's a good example of working with council to make sure you're having the emergency meeting you need because it's absolutely necessary, but you're also complying with the law because you don't want to ding on the back end.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Council.
I have one.
And-
Mr. Mayor, one of the other things that was brought up in that particular session, if you recall, was we were told we cannot abstain unless it's for one of those other reasons on a vote, that we must cast a vote unless it's for one of the reasons that we would abstain from. It's
So that's not an Open Meetings Act,
okay.
but that can be other sections of law outside of this that I didn't cover. There can also be governing body procedural rules. For example, most school districts have board policies, not only for when you can and cannot abstain, but also how an abstention gets counted. Under Robert's Rules of Order, and I don't have it fresh in the top of my mind, an abstention actually gets counted, whether it's in favor or opposed to this
It's counted
standing motion.
majority, is that correct?
Can't remember off the top of my head.
Maybe that's what.
Not in the
That
Open
book.
Meetings Act.
Yeah,
Yeah,
And
maybe
then,
that's what that.
yeah, and then sorry, I have one more
I'm not the
thing.
best parliamentarian. But there are other rules outside the Open Meetings Act that may kick in with regard to what you've raised, Council.
Sorry.
No, sir.
Yeah, she still had another question.
I'm sorry.
So
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Okay, so on the OMA as well, it is showing to where we have the public comment. So it was recommended that we do set a time limit. And you know, we are going to treat everybody equal and have a uniform time, 3 minutes is what we have in our agenda. But it does say, they did recommend to set a time limit to say we're going to have an hour to speak on this matter.
Differing minds can have different best recommendations. Again, there are no requirements under IPRA for how long or how short the public comment period is. What I have seen, because I've actually been, as a city attorney, had complaints registered against myself for advising the governing body on how to conduct a public comment period. What I've seen is if someone does not get the opportunity to speak, the effects of that can be longer and louder and more extended versus if they had the 3 minutes to speak, or if the crowd was so loud so large that it needed to be shortened to 1 minute. If they didn't get their 1 minute, it's going to be hours of issues versus 1 minute of speaking. So that's where my best practices recommendation come from. Neither of them are dictated by law.
Okay, thank you.
No, sir. Gina,
Yes.
on the quorum, will you go back over the quorum again? Because I thought I heard something different in the meeting about how you establish a quorum. And I didn't understand the presenter to say that the mayor could be counted in the quorum. I'd heard it, I may have been confused. Will you go back over that again? Because I thought he said that it's 5 and 1, and I can't. We have 8 council persons, so it's counted based on councilmatic numbers, not to include the mayor.
Sure. So, and I thought about this afternoon as I was polishing up the presentation, and I didn't really have an opportunity to go into the municipal code, which has different terminology about the role of the mayor, for example, and whether or not the mayor votes or when the mayor votes. I am familiar with some municipalities that says the mayor doesn't vote unless there's a tie, right? I'm not sure if that's the case here. I didn't get to that level of detail. Staying within the Open Meetings Act, and there may be some conflict here, but within the Open Meetings Act, which is a lot simpler, and it applies to city councils, it applies to state commissions, applies to school boards, county commissions, boards and commissions of municipalities and others if they're policy making. It's a broad general rule under Open Meetings Act. When a quorum of the governing body is present together addressing the business of the entity, then a meeting must be called. Under the Open Meetings Act, a quorum would be the 5 members of the governing body, and the mayor's a member of the governing body, as far as I understand. So that's how it is under the Open Meetings Act. If under the municipal code, it specifically defines a quorum differently, then that would be recognized, but I don't know if that gets differentiated under the municipal code for you. Okay, but the way the Open Meetings Act would treat it is if you're 9 members, 5, if the governing body is comprised of 9 members, then 5 present, including the mayor, not including.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You know, we've got quite a few employees of the city that are here, and I appreciate every one of you attending, and I'd like to, if any of the employees have questions for Tino, please feel free to raise your hand and tell us who you are and what your question is. If you do, if you don't, that's fine. So do you have anything to add?
I just want to thank you for coming down and sharing this with us, and a lot of us are still learning, so we appreciate that.
Thank you. I'm contributing to the economy tonight. I'll be eating dinner. I'll be spending the night. I'll be doing all kinds of things. I do want to give one employee example as we close. And thank you, Mayor, for recognizing the employees and giving them an opportunity. I did this presentation just to staff when I was city attorney in Santa Fe. And I talked about, by the way, in these public records, even handwritten notes can be public records. And I had an employee say, notes? My notes that I take as part of my job? Yes. And the person said, I'm never taking a note again. And I had to say, don't worry about it. You know, it's okay. Someone reads your notes, they read your notes.
Yeah.
Okay, you know, my calculation was X. Now, keep in mind, but doodle art, nobody cares about that. But boy, this presenter was an idiot, right? That could show up. So if you, you know, if you think I'm an idiot, don't put it in your. But this does affect the governing body. It does affect the staff and the community. And I want to thank the governing body because, you know, I'm also here through the proactivity of the governing body. There are times that they say, hey, it's time for a refresh. And so I've been welcomed here and I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful for the whole governing body, mayor, and to the city manager and the city attorney, because all of you together brought me here to bring this training to your community. And so I'm grateful for that. Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you.
All right, so next item is item 6, and this other business citizens be heard any matter not known about or which could not have reasonably be foreseen prior to the time of the posting of the agenda. A public body shall only act on items appearing on the agenda. So I'll open the floor a little bit if anybody wants to speak to the council tonight. If you do, please go up to the podium and introduce yourself. Have anything to say tonight? No. Anything else from the council? Next item is an executive session. Action to convene in a closed meeting to discuss matters is provided for under the New Mexico statutes related to limited personnel matters. City manager and public utilities employee. Obtain action going into executive session.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Ms. Parker, second by Mr. Hefner. Would you read the roll, please?
Sorry.
Veronica Cordova,
Yes.
Jake Lopez.
Yes.
Daniel Bowen,
Yes.
Oscar Robinson,
Yes.
Chad Heflin,
Yes.
Michael Miller,
Yes.
Diane Parker,
Yes.
Jim Lucero.
Yes.
Right. So we'll go into closed session. We're gonna take about a 5-minute break, 6-minute break for.
No.
I'd entertain action and reconvene into open session.
So moved.
Second.
Oh, my goodness. Motion by Mr. Miller, a second by Ms. Cordova. I need a roll call, please.
Veronica Cordova,
Yes.
Jake Lopez.
Yes.
Daniel Bowen,
Yes.
Oscar Robinson,
Yes.
Chad Heflin,
Yes.
Mike Miller,
Yes.
Diane Parker.
Yes.
Jim Lucero.
Yes.
Action as a result of the closed session, there was no action taken. Only the items were discussed. There was no action taken. Nothing else.